Hear Psalm 86. Mercy speaks louder than judgment. Psalm 86 is one of the most intimate prayers in the book of Psalms. Unlike songs of triumph or communal worship, this psalm places us inside the private cry of a soul under pressure. It is a prayer spoken from vulnerability, not strength. David does not approach God as a king, a warrior, or a leader, but as a servant in need of mercy. This is precisely what makes Psalm 86 so powerful. It reveals a spiritual truth that many overlook. When judgment feels imminent and the weight of life presses hard, mercy becomes the loudest voice in the room. This psalm teaches us that God's mercy is not passive or secondary. It is active, intentional, and overwhelming. Mercy is not God ignoring justice. It is God choosing restoration over destruction. In Psalm 86, David is surrounded by enemies, misunderstood, exhausted, and spiritually exposed. Yet instead of arguing his innocence or demanding vindication, he appeals to God's character. He does not say, "Judge them," but rather, "Be merciful to me." This shift in posture changes everything. Many people live as though God is primarily a judge, watching closely for mistakes. Psalm 86 dismantles that fear. It reveals a God who listens, who inclines his ear, who delights in forgiving, and who is rich in mercy to all who call upon him. This is not a distant deity waiting to condemn, but a compassionate Father responding to a broken heart. Psalm 86 also teaches us how to pray when words feel insufficient. It models honesty without irreverence, desperation without despair, and humility without shame. David does not hide his fear or minimize his pain. He brings everything before God and anchors his hope not in circumstances, but in who God is. Mercy in this psalm is louder than accusation, louder than threat, louder than internal condemnation. As we move through this psalm, we discover that mercy is not merely forgiveness for past mistakes. It is strength for the present, guidance for the future, and refuge in the storm. Mercy does not whisper timidly. It speaks with authority, silencing judgment and restoring hope. This is a psalm for anyone who feels overwhelmed, misunderstood, spiritually tired, or afraid that they have failed too many times. Psalm 86 reminds us that when judgment seems near, mercy is already speaking on our behalf, a cry from the depths, when the soul has nothing left but prayer. Psalm 86 begins not with confidence, but with vulnerability. "Incline your ear, O Lord, and answer me, for I am poor and needy." This opening line immediately sets the tone. David does not come pretending to be strong. He does not hide behind titles, past victories, or spiritual reputation. He comes empty. This is the posture that unlocks mercy. To be poor and needy here is not merely about material lack. It is spiritual exhaustion. It is the awareness that one has reached the limit of personal strength. Many people delay prayer until they feel worthy or composed, but Psalm 86 teaches the opposite. Prayer begins when we admit we cannot carry ourselves anymore. This cry from the depths is not weakness, it is spiritual clarity. David understands something crucial. God is not moved by polished language or impressive resumes. God responds to truth. When the soul is stripped of illusions, mercy has room to enter. David's request is simple but profound. He asks God to listen. This reveals a deep trust that God is attentive, not distracted. In moments of despair, people often feel unheard, unseen, or forgotten. Psalm 86 counters this lie. The very act of praying assumes that God's ear is inclined toward those who call upon him sincerely. As the psalm continues, David asks God to preserve his life, not because he deserves it, but because he trusts him. "Preserve my life, for I am devoted to you." This devotion is not perfection, it is loyalty. It is choosing God even when circumstances suggest abandonment. Mercy responds to this kind of devotion, not because it earns favor, but because it aligns the heart with truth. David then says, "You are my God. Save your servant who trusts in you." Trust is central here. Mercy is activated not by fear, but by trust. Judgment thrives in environments of fear and self-condemnation, but mercy flows where trust is present. David does not deny danger, he declares dependence. One of the most striking aspects of this psalm is that David asks for mercy repeatedly. "Be merciful to me, O Lord, for to you I cry all day long." This persistence reveals something important. Mercy is not limited. David is not afraid of exhausting God's patience. He understands that mercy is part of God's nature, not a rare exception. Many people believe they can only ask for mercy once or twice before God grows weary. Psalm 86 rejects this idea completely. David cries out all day long. He returns again and again, not with new arguments, but with the same request. Mercy does not diminish through repetition. It deepens relationship. David then speaks a powerful truth. "You, Lord, are good and ready to forgive, and abundant in mercy to all who call upon you." This is not flattery, it is theology. David is declaring who God is, even when his circumstances suggest otherwise. This declaration is crucial. When life feels hostile, we must anchor ourselves in truth rather than perception. Here we learn that mercy is not selective. It is abundant to all who call upon God. This does not mean everyone receives the same outcome, but it does mean that no one is disqualified from asking. Mercy is not reserved for the strong, the successful, or the spiritually impressive. It is offered freely to those who recognize their need. David's enemies are real. He is not imagining danger. Later in the psalm, he speaks of ruthless men rising against him. Yet even before addressing the threat, he centers his prayer on God's mercy. This order matters. When we focus first on the problem, fear grows. When we focus first on mercy, perspective shifts. This topic teaches us that prayer is not about having the right words, it is about having the right posture. A heart that admits need invites divine intervention. Mercy speaks loudest when pride is silent. The cry from the depths is not the end of the story, it is the beginning of transformation. Psalm 86 shows us that when the soul has nothing left but prayer, that prayer becomes the doorway through which mercy enters and judgment loses its voice. If this message is speaking to your heart and helping you grow spiritually, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. Your support allows this channel to continue sharing deep scripture-based teachings that strengthen faith and bring clarity in difficult seasons. Psalm 86 continues to unfold not as a theological argument, but as a lived experience of mercy overpowering fear. After David establishes his need and appeals to God's character, the psalm moves into a deeper spiritual territory, the tension between the soul's fragility and God's unwavering constancy. This tension is where mercy becomes louder than judgment, not in theory, but in lived reality. David is not praying from a peaceful place. He is surrounded by pressure, threatened by violence, and aware of his own limitations. Yet his prayer does not spiral into despair. Instead, it rises into confidence rooted entirely in who God is. At this point in the psalm, David asks God to teach him his way so that he may walk in his truth. This request reveals something profound. David understands that mercy is not only about rescue, but about direction. Judgment immobilizes, but mercy teaches. Judgment accuses, but mercy guides. When a person feels judged, by others, by circumstances, or by their own conscience, they often become paralyzed. Mercy, on the other hand, restores movement. It gives the soul a path forward. David's desire to walk in God's truth is not a demand for answers, but a longing for alignment. He does not ask God to remove every obstacle immediately. He asks for inner guidance so that his steps remain steady even while the storm continues. This is one of the deepest functions of mercy. It stabilizes the heart before it changes the situation. The phrase, "Unite my heart to fear your name," reveals an internal struggle. David's heart is divided. Part of him trusts God. Another part is shaken by fear, fatigue, and uncertainty. Mercy does not condemn this division. It addresses it. David does not pretend his faith is flawless. He brings his fragmented heart before God and asks for wholeness. Judgment would accuse him of weakness. Mercy responds by healing the fracture. A united heart does not mean a heart without emotion or doubt. It means a heart anchored in reverence, even while emotions fluctuate. David understands that fear of God, reverence, not terror, is what realigns the soul. This fear does not push him away from God. It draws him closer. Mercy operates within this reverence. It is not careless grace. It is grace that restores order. David then declares that he will praise God with all his heart. This is not because circumstances have improved, but because mercy has already shifted his inner posture. Praise here is an act of trust, not celebration. It is the soul choosing to acknowledge God's greatness even while unresolved pain remains. Judgment would say, "Wait until things change." Mercy says, "Praise anchors you while you wait." This praise is deeply personal. David says he will glorify God's name forever. This is a long-term vision formed in a short moment of prayer. Mercy expands perspective. When judgment dominates, the future feels closed and threatening. Mercy opens the future and allows hope to breathe again. David can speak of forever because mercy has reminded him that his story does not end in this moment of distress. David then acknowledges the greatness of God's mercy toward him, declaring that God has delivered his soul from the depths of the grave. This statement is powerful because it suggests that David has already experienced mercy in ways that shaped his faith. He remembers past deliverance, not as nostalgia, but as evidence. Mercy has a memory. It reminds the soul of what God has already done when fear tries to convince it that nothing will ever change. Remembering mercy is an act of resistance against judgment. Judgment says, "Look at where you are now." Mercy says, "Remember where you were and how God carried you through." David's confidence grows as he recalls that God has intervened before. This remembrance is not denial of present danger, it is fuel for perseverance. As the psalm progresses, David finally names the threat explicitly. He speaks of arrogant men rising against him, violent people seeking his life, and having no regard for God. This description is raw and honest. David does not minimize the danger or spiritualize it away. Mercy does not require denial of reality. It invites truth into God's presence. What is striking is how David contrasts these men with God. He says, "They have not set God before them." This reveals David's deepest concern. The threat is not merely physical harm, it is godlessness. The absence of reverence is what makes these men dangerous. David understands that a world without awareness of God becomes cruel and unstable. Mercy stands in contrast to this chaos. Then comes one of the most powerful declarations in the psalm. David proclaims that God is compassionate and gracious, slow to anger, abundant in loving kindness and truth. This statement echoes God's self-revelation in earlier scripture, showing that David's faith is rooted in revealed truth, not emotion. He does not invent an image of God to comfort himself. He recalls who God has already declared himself to be. This moment is critical. When judgment speaks loudly, it often distorts God's image, turning him into a harsh observer rather than a compassionate father. David refuses this distortion. He anchors his prayer in God's character. Mercy becomes louder than judgment precisely because it is grounded in truth. David then asks God to turn to him and be gracious. This request is intimate. It assumes relationship. David is not asking for distant intervention. He is asking for God's attention, presence, and strength. He asks God to give strength to his servant and save the son of his maidservant, a phrase that emphasizes humility, lineage, and belonging. David is reminding himself that he belongs to God, not to fear or enemies. This sense of belonging is essential. Judgment isolates. It convinces people they are alone, abandoned, or unworthy. Mercy restores identity. David sees himself not as a victim of circumstance, but as a servant of God. This identity stabilizes him even when external threats remain unresolved. Finally, David asks for a sign of God's goodness, not for revenge, but so that his enemies may see and be ashamed, because the Lord has helped and comforted him. This is not a prayer for humiliation of others. It is a prayer for visible mercy. David desires that God's goodness would speak louder than hostility. Mercy here becomes testimony. David believes that when God comforts him, even those who oppose him will be forced to confront a reality they cannot control. Mercy exposes the limits of human power. Judgment might silence enemies temporarily, but mercy reveals a higher authority at work. This entire movement of Psalm 86 shows that mercy is not passive. It teaches, unifies, strengthens, reminds, restores identity, and reveals God's character. Judgment speaks through fear, accusation, and isolation. Mercy speaks through truth, presence, and hope. David's prayer does not remove all danger instantly, but it transforms how he stands within it. This is the deeper victory. Mercy does not always change the situation first. It changes the soul so that the situation no longer defines it. If this teaching is helping you understand Scripture more deeply and strengthening your faith, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you help ensure that these long-form, in-depth biblical reflections continue to reach those who need clarity, hope, and spiritual grounding in challenging times. As Psalm 86 moves deeper into David's prayer, we enter the most interior layer of the psalm, where mercy is no longer only a request or a declaration, but a sustaining force that reshapes how the soul interprets reality itself. At this stage, David is no longer simply asking God to listen or to act. He is learning to exist within mercy. This is where the psalm becomes profoundly transformative, because it reveals that mercy is not just something God gives in moments of crisis, but something he uses to reform the inner world of the one who trusts him. David's prayer teaches us that judgment often operates internally long before it manifests externally. Even when enemies surround us, the harshest voice is frequently the one inside, accusing, questioning worth, replaying failures, and predicting abandonment. Psalm 86 confronts this internal courtroom and allows mercy to overrule the verdicts that fear and shame attempt to pass. Throughout this section of the psalm, David demonstrates a remarkable spiritual awareness. He understands that his greatest danger is not merely the men who rise against him, but the possibility of losing sight of who God is while under pressure. This is why he repeatedly returns to God's character. Mercy becomes louder than judgment because David refuses to let circumstances redefine God. One of the most important dynamics in Psalm 86 is the contrast between God's patience and human urgency. Judgment is impatient. It demands immediate resolution, quick punishment, or instant clarity. Mercy, by contrast, is spacious. It allows time for growth, learning, and restoration. David's prayer unfolds slowly, deliberately, almost rhythmically. He does not rush God, and he does not rush himself. This pacing is itself an act of trust. David understands that when the soul is overwhelmed, it needs more than answers. It needs reassurance of presence. Mercy provides this presence. When God's mercy is acknowledged, The soul no longer feels abandoned in uncertainty. It becomes anchored, even when outcomes remain unknown. As David reflects on God's mercy, he begins to see his suffering through a different lens. Instead of interpreting hardship as evidence of rejection, he understands it as a context in which God's faithfulness can be revealed more clearly. This shift is subtle but powerful. Judgment says, "This pain proves you are forgotten." Mercy says, "This pain is not the final word." This internal reorientation is one of the most overlooked aspects of divine mercy. Many people seek mercy solely as escape from consequences or danger, but Psalm 86 shows that mercy also changes perception. David's enemies do not disappear immediately, but their power over his inner world weakens. They no longer control his sense of identity or destiny. David's prayer also reveals that mercy restores dignity. Judgment strips dignity away, reducing a person to their lowest moment or greatest failure. Mercy, however, restores the awareness that one is seen, known, and valued by God. David speaks as a servant, but not as a slave. His servanthood is rooted in relationship, not fear. This distinction matters deeply. A slave obeys to avoid punishment. A servant remains loyal because of trust. David's language throughout Psalm 86 reflects this trust. He does not bargain with God. He does not attempt to manipulate divine response. He simply places himself before God with honesty and dependence. Mercy also reshapes how David understands power. His enemies rely on force, arrogance, and violence. God's power, by contrast, is revealed through patience, compassion, and faithfulness. This inversion of power is central to the psalm. David realizes that the loudest forces in the world are not always the strongest. Mercy may appear quiet, but it endures longer than aggression. This realization frees David from the need to retaliate. Judgment often fuels revenge, convincing the wounded soul that justice must be taken by force. Mercy interrupts this cycle. David does not ask to become stronger than his enemies. He asks to be upheld by God. This is a crucial spiritual distinction. When mercy governs the heart, strength is redefined. David's prayer also shows that mercy creates space for humility without humiliation. He acknowledges weakness openly, yet he is not crushed by it. Judgment humiliates, mercy humbles. Humility opens the soul to growth and learning, while humiliation closes it off in shame. Psalm 86 consistently moves toward humility, never toward self-loathing. Another profound aspect of this section is David's expectation that God's mercy will be visible. He believes that God's comfort will not only strengthen him internally, but will eventually become evident externally. This expectation is not entitlement, it is trust. David believes that God's nature is consistent and that mercy does not hide forever. This belief allows David to endure waiting. Waiting under judgment feels like punishment. Waiting under mercy feels like preparation. Psalm 86 teaches us that the difference lies not in the length of time, but in the meaning we assign to it. Mercy fills waiting with purpose. David's repeated emphasis on God's truth is also significant. Mercy without truth becomes indulgence. Truth without mercy becomes condemnation. Psalm 86 holds these two together perfectly. God's truth grounds David's faith, while God's mercy sustains it. This balance prevents spiritual distortion. As David continues to pray, we see that mercy also guards him against despair. Despair often arises when the soul believes that nothing good can emerge from the present situation. Mercy counters this belief by reminding the soul that God's resources are not limited by current conditions. David's confidence does not come from visible change, but from internal assurance. This assurance is not emotional excitement. It is quiet stability. Psalm 86 does not end with dramatic victory or sudden reversal. It ends with trust. This is intentional. The psalm teaches that mercy's greatest work often happens beneath the surface, long before circumstances shift. By the end of this section of the psalm, David is no longer pleading frantically. His tone has changed. There is a settled quality to his prayer, a sense that even if danger remains, he is no longer alone within it. Mercy has done its work. This is perhaps the most important lesson of Psalm 86. Mercy does not always remove the storm, but it ensures that the storm does not define the soul. Judgment speaks through fear, urgency, and accusation. Mercy speaks through presence, patience, and truth. One shatters the heart, the other strengthens it. David's experience invites every reader to examine which voice they are allowing to shape their inner world. When judgment dominates, peace becomes impossible. When mercy is received, endurance becomes possible. Psalm 86 does not promise a life without trouble, but it promises a God whose mercy is greater than any trouble we face. If this message is helping you understand God's mercy more deeply and bringing clarity to your faith journey, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you support the continuation of long, in-depth biblical teachings that speak to the heart, strengthen the spirit, and reveal the enduring power of God's mercy in every season of life. As Psalm 86 approaches its final movement, mercy is no longer something David is merely asking for or reflecting upon. It becomes the dominant atmosphere in which his entire inner life now exists. This is the stage where mercy has fully surpassed judgment, not by erasing threats or silencing enemies instantly, but by re-establishing order within the soul. David's prayer shows us that when mercy takes root deeply enough, it reshapes how a person interprets conflict, time, identity, and even opposition itself. At this point in the psalm, David is no longer overwhelmed by the presence of arrogant and violent men. They are still there, still dangerous, still unjust, yet they no longer define the emotional or spiritual center of his life. This is one of the clearest signs that mercy has taken precedence over judgment. Judgment keeps the mind locked on the offender, the threat, the injustice. Mercy lifts the focus upward, restoring God to the center where he belongs. David understands something crucial here. When God is no longer at the center of one's awareness, fear rushes in to fill the vacuum. Earlier in the psalm, David explicitly states that his enemies do not set God before them. Now, by contrast, David himself has firmly recentered his awareness on God's presence. Mercy accomplishes this recentering. It does not distract from reality, it reorders reality. One of the most powerful transformations mercy brings is the restoration of spiritual authority. Judgment strips authority away. It convinces the soul that it is small, powerless, and at the mercy of hostile forces. Mercy, however, restores the awareness that life is ultimately governed by God, not by human arrogance or circumstance. David does not suddenly gain physical control over his enemies, but he regains spiritual authority over his own heart. This restoration of authority is deeply connected to trust. Trust does not mean certainty about outcomes, it means certainty about God's character. David no longer speaks as someone scrambling for survival, but as someone grounded in relationship. His words are slower, more deliberate, infused with confidence that does not depend on immediate evidence. Mercy has taught him to wait without panic. Waiting is one of the most difficult spiritual disciplines, especially when judgment feels imminent. Under judgment, waiting feels unbearable because it is interpreted as delay, punishment, or neglect. Under mercy, waiting becomes meaningful. It becomes a space where God works invisibly, strengthening the soul in ways that will later prove essential. David's prayer reveals that mercy also reshapes how the soul understands justice. Judgment often demands immediate resolution, immediate vindication, Immediate reversal of wrongs. Mercy allows justice to unfold within God's timing. This does not mean injustice is ignored, it means it is entrusted. David does not take justice into his own hands. He places it into God's hands, trusting that God sees more clearly and judges more righteously than any human court. This act of entrusting justice is one of the clearest signs of spiritual maturity. It requires humility, patience, and deep faith. Mercy makes this possible by assuring the soul that God is neither indifferent nor absent. David believes that God's justice will come, but he no longer demands that it come on his terms. Another profound effect of mercy in this stage of the psalm is the healing of inner fragmentation. Earlier, David asked God to unite his heart. Now we see the fruit of that prayer. His inner world is no longer divided between trust and fear. Fear may still appear, but it no longer governs. Mercy has unified his heart around reverence for God. A unified heart does not mean emotional numbness. David still feels pressure and danger, but his emotions are no longer competing for control. They are brought into alignment under a higher truth. Mercy provides this alignment by reminding the soul of what matters most. David's language in this part of the psalm also reflects a deepened awareness of God's nearness. God is no longer spoken of as distant or merely responsive. He is present, attentive, and involved. Mercy brings God close. Judgment creates distance. This nearness transforms how David endures adversity. When God feels distant, suffering feels meaningless. When God feels near, suffering becomes bearable. This does not glorify pain, it contextualizes it. Mercy gives suffering context by placing it within a relationship rather than isolation. David also demonstrates that mercy produces resilience rather than escape. He does not ask to be removed from every difficulty. He asks for strength, guidance, and reassurance. Mercy equips the soul to stand, not merely to flee. This distinction is vital. A faith built solely on escape collapses when escape is delayed. A faith built on mercy endures. Another essential aspect revealed here is that mercy changes how the soul responds to hostility. David does not mirror the aggression of his enemies. He does not adopt their methods or their mindset. Judgment would justify retaliation. Mercy restrains it. This restraint is not weakness, it is strength under control. David understands that responding with violence or arrogance would align him with the very spirit he opposes. Mercy preserves integrity. It ensures that survival does not come at the cost of becoming something unrecognizable. In this stage of the psalm, David's identity is fully restored. He sees himself clearly as God's servant, loved, protected, and sustained. He is no longer defining himself by threat or vulnerability. Mercy has re-established who he is in relation to God, and this identity becomes his anchor. Identity is one of the primary targets of judgment. When judgment speaks, it attempts to redefine a person by their failures, fears, or current suffering. Mercy resists this redefinition. It reminds the soul that identity is rooted in God's choice, not circumstance. David's confidence now rests not on the absence of danger, but on the presence of God. This is the deepest victory mercy brings. When God's presence becomes more real than the threat, judgment loses its power. This section of Psalm 86 teaches us that mercy matures faith. Early faith often seeks quick answers and visible results. Mature faith seeks alignment, endurance, and truth. David's prayer shows this maturation unfolding in real time. Mercy has guided him from desperation to stability. By now, David is no longer pleading for proof that God cares. He knows. The urgency has softened into assurance. The fear has been quieted by trust. Mercy has done what judgment never could. It has healed rather than hardened, unified rather than fractured, strengthened rather than condemned. This is the kind of mercy that Psalm 86 reveals. It is not superficial comfort, it is transformative grace. It does not deny reality, but it refuses to let reality define the soul apart from God. If this teaching is strengthening your understanding of Scripture and helping you see how God's mercy works deeply within the human heart, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you support the continuation of long-form biblical reflections that bring clarity, depth, and spiritual grounding to those navigating difficult seasons of life. As Psalm 86 reaches its final spiritual resonance, mercy is no longer something David is seeking as a solution to crisis. It has become the foundation upon which he now stands. This final movement of the psalm reveals the deepest truth of all. When mercy fully speaks, judgment loses not only its authority, but its relevance. David's prayer does not conclude with the destruction of enemies or the sudden disappearance of hardship. Instead, it concludes with something far more enduring, a settled confidence that God's mercy has already secured what judgment never could. At this stage, David's inner transformation is complete. Earlier, his prayer was shaped by need, urgency, and vulnerability. Now, it is shaped by assurance. The threats that once dominated his awareness have been repositioned. They exist, but they no longer command his attention or define his emotional state. Mercy has reordered his inner world so thoroughly that fear no longer speaks with final authority. This is one of the most profound lessons of Psalm 86. Judgment always demands resolution through control. Mercy achieves resolution through trust. David no longer needs to see every problem solved in order to rest. He rests because he knows who holds the outcome. This is not resignation, it is confidence anchored in relationship. The final verses of the psalm reveal David asking God for a sign of goodness, not as proof of worth, but as a testimony of God's faithfulness. This request is deeply important. David does not ask for a sign to silence doubt within himself. His doubt has already been addressed by mercy. He asks for a sign so that those who oppose him may see that God has helped and comforted him. This request reveals that mercy ultimately becomes visible. It does not remain hidden forever. While mercy often works quietly within the soul, it eventually expresses itself outwardly. God's comfort becomes evident in stability, peace, endurance, and restored strength. Even those who wish harm cannot ignore a life sustained by divine mercy. David's desire is not humiliation of his enemies, but revelation. He wants God's goodness to be seen so clearly that opposition is rendered powerless. Mercy disarms hostility, not through force, but through undeniable presence. When God's comfort is visible, accusations lose credibility. This final posture shows that David is no longer spiritually reactive. Earlier, the actions of others strongly affected his emotional state. Now, his emotional stability is rooted in God alone. Mercy has freed him from being controlled by external hostility. This is spiritual freedom in its purest form. Another critical dimension of this final section is David's understanding of comfort. Comfort here does not mean ease or pleasure. It means assurance, companionship, and strengthening presence. God's comfort does not remove David from struggle. It fortifies him within it. Mercy comforts not by numbing pain, but by giving meaning and support that allows the soul to endure. David's experience teaches that divine comfort is not dependent on circumstances improving first. Comfort arrives through God's nearness. This nearness redefines suffering. Pain no longer signals abandonment. It becomes a space where God's faithfulness is encountered more intimately. Judgment tells the soul that pain is proof of failure or rejection. Mercy tells the soul that pain is not the measure of worth or destiny. David has fully embraced this truth. His prayer no longer seeks to escape suffering at all costs. It seeks to remain faithful, grounded, and aligned with God through suffering. This shift marks the completion of David's spiritual movement in Psalm 86. He began as one who was poor and needy, crying out for help. He ends as one who is steady, assured, and deeply anchored in God's character. Mercy has accomplished what fear never could. Another powerful aspect of this final stage is David's restored sense of time. Judgment compresses time, making the present moment feel unbearable and the future feel threatening or non-existent. Mercy expands time. David can now imagine continuity, endurance, and lasting faithfulness. His vision is no longer trapped in immediate danger. This restored sense of time allows David to live rather than merely survive. He is no longer counting moments until relief arrives. He is living faithfully within the moment, trusting that God's mercy governs both present and future. This is a profound psychological and spiritual liberation. David's final posture also reveals that mercy produces humility without insecurity. He remains deeply aware of his dependence on God, yet he is not diminished by it. Dependence has become strength. Judgment often convinces people that dependence is weakness. Mercy reveals dependence as the doorway to stability. This humility allows David to remain teachable, grounded, and responsive to God. He does not emerge from crisis hardened or cynical. He emerges softened, clearer, and more deeply connected to God. Mercy has refined him rather than embittered him. Psalm 86 ultimately teaches that mercy is not a temporary intervention, but a sustaining relationship. David's confidence does not rest on one answered prayer, but on a growing awareness of who God is. This awareness becomes the unshakable center of his life. The psalm closes without spectacle, and this is intentional. There is no dramatic victory scene because the true victory has already occurred. David's inner world has been reclaimed from fear, accusation, and despair. Mercy has spoken and judgment has fallen silent. This is the enduring power of Psalm 86. It does not promise a life without enemies or hardship. It promises a God whose mercy is greater than every threat, accusation, and fear. It promises that those who call upon him are never abandoned, even when circumstances suggest otherwise. For every reader who feels overwhelmed, misunderstood, spiritually tired, or fearful of judgment, Psalm 86 offers this assurance. Mercy is not waiting at the end of perfection. It meets the soul in honesty, vulnerability, and trust. Mercy does not shout to compete with judgment. It simply speaks with authority, and judgment fades. David's journey in this psalm invites us to make the same choice, to let mercy define our relationship with God rather than fear. When we do, we discover that mercy does not merely rescue us from moments of crisis. It reshapes how we live, endure, and hope. If this final teaching has strengthened your faith and helped you see the depth and power of God's mercy more clearly, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you support the creation of long, in-depth biblical reflections that speak to the heart, illuminate Scripture, and offer spiritual grounding for those walking through challenging seasons. As Psalm 86 continues to echo beyond its final words, a deeper layer emerges, one that extends past David's personal prayer and speaks directly into the ongoing spiritual experience of every generation. This psalm does not end when the prayer ends. It continues wherever mercy is chosen over judgment. Topic 6 explores this after effect of mercy. What happens when a soul that has been shaped by mercy begins to walk forward into life again? It is here that Psalm 86 reveals its lasting power, because mercy is not only something received in prayer, but something carried into daily existence. Once mercy has spoken decisively within the soul, it begins to alter how a person engages with the world. David does not return from prayer unchanged. The world he re-enters is still broken, still dangerous, still unjust in many ways. But he is no longer the same man who entered prayer burdened and fragmented. Mercy has restructured his inner life, and that restructuring inevitably affects his outward walk. One of the first fruits of mercy is discernment. Judgment simplifies reality into enemies and allies, guilt and innocence, success and failure. Mercy introduces depth. David now sees people, events, and even himself through a lens shaped by God's patience and compassion. This does not make him naive, it makes him wise. He understands that human behavior is often driven by fear, pride, and spiritual blindness rather than pure malice. This discernment protects the heart from bitterness. Bitterness thrives where judgment dominates. It grows when pain is interpreted as intentional cruelty rather than brokenness. Mercy interrupts this cycle by allowing the soul to acknowledge harm without being consumed by hatred. David does not excuse injustice, but he no longer allows injustice to poison his spirit. Another lasting effect of mercy is emotional stability. Before mercy takes root, emotions are often reactive. Fear responds to threat, anger responds to offense, despair responds to delay. After mercy reshapes the soul, emotions become responsive rather than reactive. David still feels, but his feelings no longer control him. They are informed by truth rather than driven by fear. This emotional stability is not emotional suppression. David does not become numb or detached. Instead, he becomes grounded. Mercy anchors emotion in relationship with God, preventing it from spiraling into extremes. This grounding allows David to engage with life more fully, not less. Mercy also changes how time is experienced. Judgment creates urgency that borders on panic. Everything feels immediate, critical, and overwhelming. Mercy slows the internal clock. David no longer feels chased by time or threatened by delay. He understands that God's purposes unfold over seasons, not moments. This slower rhythm allows for patience, not passive waiting, but active trust. David can now move forward without demanding instant resolution. He can make decisions thoughtfully rather than defensively. Mercy gives him the freedom to live intentionally instead of reactively. Another profound transformation brought by mercy is the restoration of spiritual curiosity. Judgment narrows vision. It forces the soul into survival mode, where creativity, learning, and wonder are suppressed. Mercy reopens these capacities. David's desire to be taught God's way earlier in the psalm now bears fruit. He becomes receptive again to instruction, correction, and growth. This teachability is a sign of deep healing. When a person feels judged, they often become defensive and closed. Mercy dissolves this defensiveness. David is no longer protecting himself from God, he is walking with God. This shift makes spiritual growth possible again. Mercy also reshapes how failure is understood. Under judgment, failure becomes identity. Under mercy, failure becomes information. David does not deny his limitations or mistakes, but they no longer define him. They inform him. Mercy transforms failure into a teacher rather than a sentence. This transformation is crucial for sustained faith. Without mercy, repeated failure leads to despair or hypocrisy. With mercy, failure becomes part of the refinement process. David can now live honestly before God without fear of rejection. As David moves forward, mercy also influences how he treats others. Having been sustained by compassion, he becomes less inclined toward harshness. This does not mean he tolerates injustice or abandons discernment. It means his responses are measured, thoughtful, and aligned with God's character rather than driven by wounded pride. Mercy does not make David weak, it makes him restrained. Restraint is often misunderstood as passivity, but it is actually a sign of strength. The ability to choose response rather than reaction requires internal authority, and mercy restores this authority. Another lasting outcome of mercy is resilience. Not the kind of resilience that hardens the heart, but the kind that keeps it open under pressure. David can now endure future challenges without collapsing inwardly. He has learned that difficulty does not equal abandonment, and delay does not equal denial. This resilience is rooted in memory. David remembers what mercy has already done. Memory becomes a spiritual resource. When new challenges arise, he does not start from zero. He draws strength from past encounters with God's faithfulness. Psalm 86 teaches that mercy creates continuity in faith. Each experience of God builds upon the last, forming a narrative of trust. Judgment fragments this narrative, making each failure feel final. Mercy weaves experiences together into a coherent story of growth. Mercy also redefines success. Under judgment, success is survival, victory, or vindication. Under mercy, success becomes faithfulness, integrity, and alignment with God. David no longer measures his life by whether enemies disappear, but by whether he remains grounded in truth. This redefinition brings freedom. When success is external, peace is fragile. When success is internal alignment with God, peace becomes durable. David now carries peace into uncertainty, rather than waiting for certainty to produce peace. Another essential dimension of mercy is hope, not optimism, but grounded expectation. David's hope is no longer tied to specific outcomes. It is tied to God's character. This hope can endure disappointment without collapsing because it is not outcome dependent. Hope rooted in mercy allows David to engage the future without fear. The unknown no longer threatens him. It becomes a space where God's faithfulness can be revealed in new ways. Mercy turns uncertainty into possibility. As Psalm 86 continues to live within the heart, it teaches that mercy is not the absence of judgment, but the triumph of relationship over condemnation. Judgment may speak, but it does not have the final word. Mercy does. David's journey shows that mercy does not erase responsibility, discipline, or truth. It integrates them into a framework of love and patience. This integration is what allows faith to mature rather than collapse under pressure. Ultimately, Topic 6 reveals that mercy is not an event, but a way of living. It is the lens through which reality is interpreted, decisions are made, and relationships are navigated. David's prayer becomes David's posture. Psalm 86 invites every reader into this same posture. It does not promise an easy life, but it promises a grounded one. A life where fear does not dominate, judgment does not define, and mercy speaks with enduring authority. When mercy becomes the governing voice of the soul, life does not become painless, but it becomes meaningful. Struggle does not disappear, but it no longer destroys. Faith does not become effortless, but it becomes resilient. This is the lasting gift of Psalm 86. It teaches that mercy is not merely God's response to our weakness. It is God's way of forming strength within us. When mercy speaks fully, judgment fades into the background, and the soul learns how to live again. If this teaching continues to deepen your understanding of Scripture and strengthen your spiritual walk, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you help sustain the creation of long, thoughtful biblical reflections that guide, ground, and encourage those seeking truth, clarity, and enduring faith in a complex world. As Psalm 86 continues to echo through the soul long after its words have been spoken, its final and most enduring work becomes clear. Mercy does not merely comfort the wounded heart, it trains the soul to live differently. Topic 7 explores this deepest layer of transformation, the way mercy reshapes conscience, devotion, endurance, and the everyday posture of faith. By this point in David's journey, mercy has not only silenced judgment, it has established a new internal order, one that governs how he thinks, chooses, and perseveres in the ordinary rhythms of life. One of the most subtle yet powerful effects of mercy is how it reshapes conscience. Judgment weaponizes conscience, turning it into a relentless accuser. It replays failures, exaggerates flaws, and convinces the soul that it is perpetually on trial. Mercy does not erase conscience, it heals it. David's prayer in Psalm 86 reveals a conscience that has been restored to its proper role, not as prosecutor, but as guide. A healed conscience does not excuse wrongdoing, but it does not crush the soul under the weight of it either. Mercy allows the conscience to speak truth without condemnation. This is why David can remain honest before God without collapsing into shame. He has learned that God's correction flows from love, not rejection. This realization frees him to remain open rather than defensive. As David carries mercy forward, devotion itself begins to change shape. Early devotion is often fueled by fear of consequence or desire for protection. Mature devotion, shaped by mercy, is fueled by gratitude and trust. David no longer seeks God merely to escape danger. He seeks God because relationship has become the center of his life. This shift in devotion is critical. Fear-based devotion cannot endure prolonged hardship. It fractures under disappointment. Mercy-based devotion, however, deepens through hardship. David's faith does not shrink after crisis. It expands. Mercy has taught him that God is not only a rescuer in emergencies, but a companion in endurance. Another profound transformation brought by mercy is the sanctification of endurance. Endurance under judgment is grim and joyless, marked by resentment and exhaustion. Endurance under mercy, however, becomes meaningful. David learns not only how to survive difficulty, but how to grow within it. This growth does not occur through constant emotional intensity. It occurs through quiet consistency. Mercy teaches the soul to remain faithful in small, unseen acts, choosing trust over despair, patience over panic, truth over fear. These choices may seem insignificant in isolation, but over time they reshape character. David's prayer shows that mercy produces a kind of spiritual stamina that judgment can never create. Judgment may coerce compliance, but it cannot sustain devotion. Mercy, by contrast, strengthens devotion from the inside out. David's faith becomes resilient not because circumstances improve, but because his inner foundations have been reinforced. As mercy continues its work, it also changes how David understands spiritual warfare. Earlier, enemies were primarily external, violent men, arrogant threats, visible danger. Now David understands that the most decisive battles are internal. Fear, despair, pride, and bitterness pose greater threats than any external opposition. Mercy equips David to face these internal battles with clarity. He no longer fights fear with denial or bravado. He meets it with truth. He no longer fights despair with distraction. He meets it with remembrance of God's faithfulness. Mercy provides the tools for sustained inner vigilance. This vigilance is not paranoia. It is awareness. David becomes attentive to the movements of his own heart. He recognizes when judgment attempts to reclaim ground through subtle accusations or renewed fear. Mercy has trained him to respond quickly, redirecting his focus toward God rather than allowing negative patterns to take root. Another lasting fruit of mercy is clarity of purpose. Judgment clouds purpose by narrowing life to survival. Mercy restores purpose by reconnecting life to meaning. David's existence is no longer defined by avoiding harm. It is defined by honoring God, walking in truth, and remaining faithful. This clarity allows David to engage life proactively rather than defensively. He can plan, hope, and act without being consumed by fear of loss. Mercy does not guarantee safety, but it restores direction. David knows why he lives, not just how to survive. Mercy also reshapes how David understands weakness. Under judgment, weakness is something to hide or overcome at all costs. Under mercy, weakness becomes a point of connection with God. David no longer resents his limitations. He acknowledges them openly, trusting that God's strength meets him there. This acceptance does not lead to passivity. It leads to humility. Humility allows David to depend on God without shame. This dependence becomes a source of stability rather than insecurity. Mercy teaches that dependence is not failure, it is alignment. As Psalm 86 continues to shape David's inner life, it becomes clear that mercy produces wisdom, not theoretical wisdom, but lived wisdom, the kind that knows when to speak and when to remain silent, when to act and when to wait. Judgment rushes, mercy discerns. David's decisions are no longer driven by urgency or fear of judgment. They are shaped by reverence, patience, and trust. This wisdom does not eliminate mistakes, but it prevents panic. Mercy has given David space to think, reflect, and respond thoughtfully. Another essential transformation is how mercy redefines spiritual success. Earlier, success may have meant deliverance from enemies or visible vindication. Now, success is measured by faithfulness, integrity, and alignment with God's will. David understands that a life faithful to God is successful regardless of external outcomes. This redefinition frees David from comparison and rivalry. Judgment thrives on comparison, constantly measuring worth against others. Mercy dissolves this compulsion. David no longer needs to prove himself. His worth is settled in relationship with God. Mercy also deepens David's capacity for gratitude. Gratitude under judgment is conditional and fleeting. Gratitude under mercy is stable and sincere. David is grateful not only for rescue, but for presence, guidance, and comfort. This gratitude sustains joy, even in uncertain seasons. Joy shaped by mercy is quiet but durable. It does not depend on favorable conditions. It flows from trust. David's joy is not exuberant celebration, it is calm assurance. Mercy has replaced anxiety with peace that endures. As we reach the final depth of Psalm 86's influence, it becomes clear that mercy ultimately forms a way of being. It's not merely something received in prayer, it is something embodied in life. David becomes a living testimony to the truth that mercy truly speaks louder than judgment. Judgment may still whisper accusations, circumstances may still threaten, fear may still attempt to return, but mercy now has the final word. It governs David's conscience, devotion, endurance, and hope. It shapes how he lives, not just how he prays. Psalm 86 invites every reader into this same transformation. It teaches that mercy is not reserved for moments of collapse. It is the foundation upon which a resilient, faithful life is built. When mercy speaks fully, judgment loses its grip, and the soul learns how to walk forward with clarity, strength, and peace. If this final topic has helped you see how God's mercy reshapes not only moments of prayer, but the entire posture of life, take a moment now to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you support the continued creation of long, in-depth biblical teachings that nurture faith, restore perspective, and help believers walk forward, grounded in truth, mercy, and enduring hope.